They waited for him to fail, certain that he didn't belong here. But when Daniel solved a problem that even MIT PhDs struggled with, the entire auditorium fell silent, and for the first time, those who had once looked down on him were forced to rethink their assumptions. University of Michigan. On a gloomy morning, cold white lights illuminated the massive lecture hall for advanced calculus. More than 100 students had taken their seats, flipping through their notebooks, opening their laptops, preparing to face one of the most rigorous professors in the department, Linda Cartwright. Today was not a normal class. The front rows were not only filled with students, a group of professors from different departments were present, sitting right at the front like judges observing a trial. They weren't there to learn. They were there to evaluate. This was an open lecture where Cartwright would demonstrate her unforgiving teaching methods. To them, her severity was necessary. Weak students had no place in the world of mathematics, and those who weren't up to par would be eliminated from the very first round. In the middle rows, a young man quietly lowered his head, his fingers spinning a pen. He didn't draw attention to himself, didn't talk to anyone. A gray hoodie, simple jeans, and a notebook filled with neat handwriting. His name was Daniel Reed. He didn't need to stand out. After all, the numbers in his mind spoke for him. But for some, just the color of his skin was enough to give them a reason to look down on him. In the front row, Professor Whitaker, one of the most influential lecturers in the department, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. His gaze swept over the students in the class, then froze when he saw Daniel. He smirked, chuckling softly. That black student in an advanced math class? I bet he won't last the whole session. The professors next to him nodded in agreement, as if it were an obvious truth. These sciences aren't meant for them. Probably got in here through some kind of affirmative action. Soft laughter echoed. No one bothered to hide it. They weren't talking about mathematics. They were talking about Daniel. But Daniel remained silent. He was all too familiar with such comments. They thought he would fail. They thought they were right. They had no idea that today would be the day they made the biggest mistake of their lives. The atmosphere in the lecture hall seemed to thicken as the sharp click of Professor Linda Cartwright's high heels echoed on the cold tile floor. Her entrance brought an absolute wave of silence. No one dared speak. No one dared to be distracted. Her posture was straight, her silver-rimmed glasses reflecting the cold light, her face showing nothing but absolute confidence, an authority that didn't need to be expressed with words. She didn't need to ask for respect because, the moment she walked in, she demanded it. Cartwright scanned the room, not in a hurry. She wasn't just checking for focus. She was assessing who could keep up and who was simply wasting space in her classroom. Students' gazes immediately dropped, avoiding her sharp eyes as if they feared that even a moment's distraction would make them the target. Then her gaze stopped on Daniel. It wasn't long, but it was enough to show what she was thinking. That look wasn't just observation, it was a silent message, a question unspoken but clear enough that no one could miss it. Do you think you belong here? In an instant, Cartwright narrowed her eyes, then moved them away, as if Daniel's existence wasn't worth her attention. No one noticed, but Daniel did. She turned, took a piece of chalk, and wrote on the board with sharp, precise strokes. Last week we studied multivariable limits. Today we move on to Laplace transforms. Immediately, complex equations appeared, one after the other, neat and precise. The students scrambled to take notes, trying not to fall behind. Some were confused from the very first line, but no one dared speak up. In Cartwright's class, getting lost was your fault, not hers. In the front row, some guest professors nodded quietly, satisfied with Cartwright's teaching style. They admired her not only for her brilliance, but for her harshness as well. They believed a great teacher wasn't one who helped students grow, but one who eliminated those who didn't deserve to be there. In the middle row, Daniel didn't rush to write notes. He observed, his eyes moving over the board calmly, coldly. While others struggled to keep up with Cartwright's pace, he simply looked, as if those mathematical symbols were mere pieces in a puzzle he had known for a long time. But then he frowned. A small mistake. Not clear enough for everyone to see, but for Daniel it was a serious error. He glanced around. No one seemed to notice. Everyone was just copying down like machines, not really understanding what was happening. Cartwright continued writing, confident as if she had never made a mistake in her life. Daniel scanned the equation again, more certain now. Yes, there was a mistake. A small deviation in how the transform was applied. It wouldn't have an immediate effect, but if continued, the final result would be completely wrong. He hesitated. He knew that if he spoke up, he would become the center of attention. Cartwright wasn't the type to like being corrected, especially not in front of students and other professors. She wasn't the kind of person who took challenges lightly. And moreover, Daniel wasn't stupid enough to think Cartwright was the only one in the room with prejudices. A whole row of guest professors were sitting there. Many of them had looked at him with disdain the moment he entered. If he spoke up, he wouldn't just be confronting Cartwright, he'd be confronting the whole system. He could ignore it, let it slide, continue with the lecture like everyone else. But that thought made him feel nauseous. Daniel hated arrogance, hated people who believed they could never be wrong, hated those who looked down on others just because they didn't look like them. A decision made in a few seconds. He took a slow breath, raised his hand, and broke the silence of the room. "Professor, there's a mistake in the transform." The space seemed to freeze. Cartwright stopped writing. The whole class went completely silent. A multitude of eyes turned to Daniel. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the silence of the students. It was Cartwright's faint smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator who had found its prey, daring to challenge it. Each second stretched on endlessly. Cartwright didn't need to shout, didn't need to show anger. She simply looked at Daniel, evaluating him like a math problem whose solution she already knew. Then she smiled lightly. "A mistake, you say?" She turned back, scanned the board as if just for show, then turned back to Daniel. "Are you sure?" Her voice was soft, but beneath it was a trap laced with danger. Some of the guest professors smirked in disdain. A few students started whispering. A professor beside Whitaker leaned in and whispered into his ear, "I told you, he's just dug his own grave." Whitaker chuckled softly, folded his arms, and waited for the perfect destruction he was about to witness. Daniel stared straight into Cartwright's eyes, unwavering. "Yes, I'm sure." Cartwright stopped smiling, and for a split second, Daniel saw her expression change. No longer a smug person, but someone who was considering whether she might have just made a mistake. The lecture hall seemed to freeze in that moment. The rustling of pages, the hurried typing on keyboards, all went silent. Only one thing remained, the razor-sharp gaze of Cartwright. Her eyes pierced through the student who had just spoken up, neither angry nor raised in volume, but enough to make every cell in the opposing person's body shrink in fear. "Do you think or do you know?" The question echoed in the stillness, steady like a blade gliding across the surface of glass. There was no explosion of anger, only a chilling coldness. An unspoken reminder that in this room, only one person was allowed to speak the truth. The student froze, gripping her pen as if it were her only lifeline. I just thought that If you're not sure, don't waste my time." The invisible strike had fallen. Her face turned crimson. She lowered her head, quickly retreating as if she wished to disappear. No one spoke. No one wanted to be the next target. Daniel closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He had witnessed too many scenes like this before. Professors who placed themselves on a pedestal, treating students as those without the right to question, like children needing to be taught through fear. He hated that kind of professor. And so, he raised his hand. The whispers dwindled, then disappeared entirely. A slight arching of Cartwright's brow passed across her face. She wasn't surprised, but she didn't seem pleased either. It was a neutral expression, as if this were a game whose outcome she already knew. "Yes?" Daniel was resolute. Unlike the girl earlier, he didn't hesitate. "Actually, there's a mistake in the transformation step." All eyes in the lecture hall turned to him instantly. The coefficient was introduced too early. At that moment, the atmosphere had completely shifted. It was no longer the hesitation of students before Cartwright, but anticipation, an eager wait for someone to be crushed. And the guest professors were the most excited. Whitaker chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. It was a venomous amusement. "This kid thinks he's smarter than Cartwright?" Another professor smiled, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with an anticipation as if ready to enjoy a thrilling spectacle. Cartwright didn't respond immediately. She remained standing, still staring at Daniel, her gaze unwavering. The silence stretched intentionally, as if she were allowing him to sink into his own foolishness. Then she smiled. It was not a kind smile, nor a friendly one. It was a smile full of arrogance. "Are you sure?" The question again. And this time, it was not just a question. It was a warning. Daniel did not flinch. "Yes, I'm sure." A brief flicker crossed Cartwright's face, but quickly, she regained her usual haughty expression. She slowly turned back, her eyes lifting to the board. Once again, the silence stretched. Daniel didn't need to look at the board because he knew he was right. But he wasn't the only one who saw the truth. Some students began whispering, a few leaning forward, trying to double-check the equation on the board. And then, one of the guest professors began to pay attention. She was looking for the mistake. And Daniel knew that, because the mistake was there. Cartwright scanned each line of the board with extreme care. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find a reason to refute him. The truth could not be denied. But if she admitted it, she would lose the most valuable thing, her absolute authority. Daniel had put her in a position where she couldn't control the situation. Cartwright clenched the piece of chalk tightly in her hand. The lecture hall seemed to freeze again. Then she turned back, looking at Daniel with a smile no longer carrying her previous arrogance. "Good, if you're so confident." She extended her hand, passing the chalk to Daniel. "Go to the board and fix it." At that moment, the whispers in the class turned into quiet laughter. Some students exchanged knowing glances, as if they understood what was about to unfold. But the most important thing wasn't how the students reacted. It was how the guest professors reacted. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his lips curling into a faint smile. "This just got interesting." Another professor nodded, a tone of excitement in his voice. He just backed himself into a corner. They knew Cartwright well. They knew this was not just a simple request, it was a trap. Daniel stood up calmly. He didn't say a word, showing no emotion on his face, but as he walked to the board, as he took the chalk from Cartwright's hand, he knew he couldn't back down. Because from this moment on, this was no longer a class, this was a battle. A brief moment passed as Daniel held the chalk in his hand, but in Cartwright's eyes it was a battlefield she had already set up. She knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to threaten. A good trap isn't one that scares the prey right from the start. It's one that makes the prey step in with confidence. The moment Daniel stepped up to the board, he heard a soft chuckle from the front row. A guest professor, Professor Whitaker, leaned slightly toward the colleague sitting next to him, his voice low enough for no one else to hear but clear enough to be an insulting whisper. "Look at him, he actually thinks he can do this. Let's see when he falls apart." Cartwright stood there, arms crossed in front of her chest, in no rush. In her mind, the outcome of this little drama had already been decided. She had seen students like Daniel before, self-satisfied, arrogant, thinking that just because they solved a problem, they could put themselves on the same level as the great minds. But she had never lost a battle. She had never let a student, especially one like Daniel, take away her absolute power in this classroom. Daniel didn't care about the whispers behind him. He simply erased the mistake, replacing it with a more accurate transformation. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Each stroke of the chalk on the board was firm, no trembling, no errors. The classroom grew eerily silent. No more whispers like before. The students who had been mocking him were now leaning forward, staring at the board, trying to figure out what Daniel was doing. One student blinked a few times, looked at his notebook, then back at the board. Wait, did he actually fix it? No one could deny it. Cartwright stared at the board, her arms crossed tighter. She couldn't refute it. The thing is, Cartwright rarely made mistakes, and if she did, no one was brave enough to point them out in front of her. But now, her mistake was right in front of everyone. She could ignore it. She could try to twist the situation, but once the problem was fixed correctly, she couldn't deny the truth. And Cartwright hated that truth. She pursed her lips and then nodded curtly, as if this meant nothing. Good. But Daniel didn't miss the brief tension in her expression, the slight tightening of her hand, and especially the fleeting glance between her and Whitaker, an unspoken look that said the battle wasn't over yet. And then Cartwright played her next card. She turned away, took the chalk, and began writing a new problem on the board, faster, more complex, mathematical symbols overlapping like a maze with no exit. Some students looked at each other confused, trying to follow the steps, but the more they looked, the more tangled it seemed. When she finished, she turned back to face Daniel, the chalk in her hand like a sword ready to strike. "But if you're really that good?" She placed the chalk in the tray, the clink of it cutting through the silence. "Do you dare to try a harder problem?" The lecture hall erupted in excited whispers. Cartwright wasn't just challenging Daniel. She was challenging him in front of the entire faculty. She didn't just want to defeat him. She wanted to utterly destroy his self-esteem. A guest professor chuckled lightly, his voice filled with excitement. So, the real fun is just beginning. Whitaker smiled knowingly. "I bet it will stumble at the first step." Daniel looked at the problem on the board. A problem not meant for freshmen, not meant for undergraduates. A problem that even graduate students might spend hours trying to solve. Daniel took a slow breath. Not because he was scared, but because he knew exactly what was happening. Cartwright wanted to push him to the edge, make him bow his head, admit he had gone too far. But what she didn't know was, he lived for moments like this. Daniel slowly placed his hand on the chalk. The room fell silent again. He was calm, showing no sign of fear. He had accepted the challenge. And if Cartwright thought he would crumble, she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The chalk slid across the board like a knife cutting through the air. Cartwright wrote each line deliberately, the mathematical symbols curving and overlapping as though they were not only written to challenge Daniel but also to intimidate him. This problem was not just a challenge. It was a declaration of war. The equation stretched twice as long as the previous one, with higher-order functions, nested integrals, and a system of nonlinear transformations that even the brightest students would have to chew on for hours. Cartwright didn't just want to beat Daniel. She wanted to crush him in front of everyone. She wanted to turn him into an example, a reminder to every student in the class that no one could challenge her without paying the price. A visiting professor sneered, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the table with clear delight. He'll be stuck soon enough. A few students gasped. Some others fell silent, unsure whether to feel fearful or excited about what was about to unfold. Cartwright set the chalk down, stepped back, and turned to face Daniel. She waited. The whole class waited, but Daniel didn't flinch. He stared at the problem for a few seconds. Not too long, not too short, just enough to understand its structure. Then he began to write. Without a hint of hesitation, not a single second spent pondering. The chalk in Daniel's hand moved smoothly and precisely, as if his mind had already seen the answer and was simply transcribing it in the exact order he had mapped out in his head. The numbers and symbols appeared organized, the transformations performed with elegance. No unnecessary steps, no hesitations. Like a pianist gliding over the keys, each stroke of his chalk was part of a perfect mathematical symphony. The murmurs in the class began to fade. At first, some students whispered, thinking Daniel was merely trying to appear confident, but then they looked back at the board and realized everything was correct. No mistakes, no stumbles. Daniel didn't hesitate, didn't revise anything. He was solving the problem at an unbelievable pace. In the front row, Whitaker had stopped laughing. Cartwright maintained her posture, but her fingers tightened slightly. Not out of fear, but confusion. Where had she gone wrong? She was certain this problem was tough enough to trap any student at least for a moment. But Daniel didn't just solve it. He did so with absolute confidence. She glanced around the room, trying to find someone who felt the same as she did, someone who was also realizing the tide had turned. And she realized everyone else was realizing it. Daniel wasn't just solving the problem. He was taking back control of the room. Daniel finished the last line. He set the chalk down, took a step back, and then turned to face Cartwright. The silence in the classroom became suffocating. Everyone looked at the board, then at Cartwright, then back at the board, as though they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. One student whispered quietly, "What the hell just happened?" A visiting professor adjusted his glasses, his gaze fixed on the board, desperately searching for any error, no matter how small. But there was nothing wrong. The problem had been solved flawlessly. Cartwright stood frozen. An invisible tension hung around her, as if a rope was slowly tightening around her neck. She needed a mistake. She needed something she could use to dismiss Daniel, to regain control, to prove she was still the one in charge of the classroom. But she found nothing, because there was no mistake. At the back of the room, a student let out a low whistle, a sound that broke the tense silence. Some other students began to whisper, but this time it wasn't mocking or skeptical. It was admiration. Something Cartwright had never expected to hear in this classroom. Admiration for a student she had purposely underestimated. Whitaker no longer looked amused. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His eyes narrowed. The earlier mocking confidence had completely vanished. Now, in his eyes, there was only one thing left, a discomfort mixed with a fear he didn't want to admit. It can't be. There's no way he's this good. Cartwright finally spoke, but her voice was no longer as firm as before. Well, not bad. A cold, dry remark, without a hint of emotion, but everyone could hear the awkwardness in it. Cartwright didn't want to admit the truth, but even she couldn't deny what the whole room had witnessed. Daniel Reed had passed the test. Not just passed, he had done so perfectly, to the point where no one could argue. Daniel didn't need to smile. He didn't need to be arrogant or provocative. He simply walked back to his seat as every eye remained fixed on him, filled with astonishment. Cartwright clenched her fist. She knew she couldn't let this end like this. If Daniel had passed this test, she would throw another one his way, a challenge he couldn't possibly overcome. And so, she picked up the chalk again. Well then, let's see what you can do with the next problem. This battle, it had only just begun. The silence in the classroom stretched like an unresolved, tense musical note. The gazes still lingered on the blackboard, where Daniel had just solved the equation flawlessly, without a single mistake. In the front row, Whitaker could no longer maintain the calm composure he had at the beginning. He raised an eyebrow, one hand on the desk, his fingers tapping lightly in rhythm with his suppressed frustration. It's impossible. Surely he must have studied this problem beforehand. His words were not only directed at the other professors, but also served as a self-reassurance. Whitaker could not accept that an unknown black student could solve such a complex problem more smoothly than graduate students. The professor next to him nodded in agreement, but was still stunned. They didn't say it out loud, but everyone knew. They had misjudged Daniel Reed. But Cartwright wasn't going to let confusion take over. She wouldn't allow herself to lose. Without saying a word, Cartwright walked to the lectern and pulled out a thick advanced calculus textbook. A hefty book filled with problems that even graduate students struggled to understand. She was no longer trying to corner Daniel with ordinary equations. She was going to raise the stakes to an entirely new level, a doctoral level problem. She opened the book, flipped to a page near the end, then turned it towards Daniel and the entire class. Solve it. The atmosphere in the room immediately shifted. Whispers erupted like crashing waves. Students lifted their heads, some leaning forward, trying to see what challenge Cartwright had just thrown out. One student inhaled anxiously, "This is it for him." Another whispered in disbelief, "Is she serious? This is a level for doctoral candidates, not freshmen." A visiting professor chuckled, but his tone was no longer mocking, instead filled with genuine curiosity. "Now, we'll see if this kid really has talent or if he's just lucky." Cartwright didn't blink, her gaze still cold and sharp as a knife. She believed Daniel would stumble this time. She believed no student, no matter how smart, could surpass their own limits when pushed too far. She waited for him to hesitate, for him to panic, for him to falter. But what she didn't expect was that Daniel merely smirked. Not a hint of fear, not a shred of tension. He stood up, walking slowly yet confidently to the board, as if he had known this would happen. Some students held their breath, while others let out a small laugh, unsure whether it was out of nervousness or disbelief. But when Daniel picked up the chalk, everything changed. No hesitation, no awkwardness as everyone had anticipated. He immediately began solving the problem, as though he had done this hundreds of times before. Cartwright narrowed her eyes. She didn't like this. She wanted to see Daniel flounder, wanted to see him stop to think. wanted to see him bite his lip or furrow his brow like the other students when faced with problems beyond their ability. But Daniel showed no sign of fear. Instead, his hand moved faster than with the previous problem, as though he had just found a problem truly worthy of him. Mathematical symbols appeared on the board with a terrifying clarity. Every transformation was accurate, with no unnecessary steps. The students watching the problem began to understand that he wasn't just solving it, he was refining it, making it easier to understand, shortening the process that others might take hours to work through step by step. Some students started glancing at each other, their faces incredulous. A visiting professor tilted his head slightly, his gaze showing a trace of admiration. Impossible! Whitaker instinctively clenched his fist, his face shifting from frustration to genuine concern. What the hell is this? Daniel kept writing, as if unaware that the entire room was watching every stroke of his chalk. But he was fully aware. He knew exactly how Cartwright and Whitaker were feeling in that moment. And he relished it. 1 minute, then 2. Cartwright clenched her hand, her eyes now showing a cold gleam that was no longer smugness, but real worry. Because she had made a mistake. She hadn't just challenged Daniel. She had given him the chance to showcase himself in front of the entire class. And now, everyone was witnessing something undeniable. Daniel wasn't just good, he was frighteningly brilliant. Daniel set the chalk down. He took a step back, crossed his arms, his gaze calm yet sharp. The problem had been solved, and no one in the room could deny it. A visiting professor let out a soft breath, looking at the board again, as if to check if he was dreaming. Cartwright was silent. Whitaker was silent. All the professors were silent. There were no excuses left. No one could say it was just a lucky coincidence. Daniel had won, right on their own turf. And for the first time in Cartwright's teaching career, she didn't know what to say next. The sound of chalk hitting the tray echoed clearly in the silent space. A small sound, but it marked an irreversible moment. Daniel turned around, facing Cartwright. He said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. Everything he needed to convey was already on the blackboard, where the doctoral-level problem had been solved perfectly, where arrogance had been defeated by truth. Cartwright stood motionless, her mouth slightly opened as if she was about to say something. A denial, a rejection, some way to regain control. But nothing came out. Because she knew there was nothing left to say. She had waited for the moment when Daniel would falter, hesitate, make a mistake, apologize, or even give up. But instead, he solved the challenge as easily as if it were just a routine exercise. And now, he stood there, waiting for her to accept what she had always refused to believe, that he was not just good, but better than she had ever imagined. A visiting professor suddenly clapped, a challenging sound not for Daniel, but for Cartwright's terrifying silence. Then another professor clapped. A student stood up, then another, then a whole group. The applause started to spread across the lecture hall like a wave crashing. At first, it was surprise, then recognition, and finally, absolute respect. Some students cheered. Some slapped their hands on the desk. Those who had doubted Daniel now only had admiring gazes. Cartwright clenched her fists. She had lost. Not just lost a problem. She had lost on the very playing field she had once controlled completely. Lost in front of the visiting professors who had once respected her. Lost in front of the students who had once feared her. Lost to a student she had once looked down on. And what hurt her more than anything else was that she could do nothing to change that truth. Whitaker, sitting in the front row, looked as if he had been doused with cold water. His face lost all smugness, his eyes only showing discomfort mixed with an unmasked fear. He wanted to refute, wanted to say something to lessen Daniel's victory, but he couldn't. There was no mistake to cling to, no way to twist the truth. Daniel had won, and everyone knew it. Amid the noise of clapping, Daniel remained calm. He didn't smile smugly as they had expected. He didn't show arrogance. He just stood there, silently observing. Because he knew that true victory wasn't in the applause. True victory lay in the silence of those who had once thought he didn't deserve to be there. Finally, Cartwright spoke, but her voice no longer had its usual sharpness, no longer the absolute confidence. She cleared her throat lightly, her gaze colder than ever, but also betraying an unprecedented confusion. Not bad, just 3 words, no praise, no real acknowledgement, just an empty statement, made only to avoid further embarrassment. Daniel nodded slightly. He didn't need her to praise him. He didn't need any of them to recognize him. Because he had done what no one could deny, he had let the truth speak for itself. The students were still standing, the applause not yet dying down. A few started to look at Cartwright differently, not with the same absolute reverence, but with curiosity. They realized something they had never considered before, that Cartwright wasn't always right, that her power wasn't absolute, that a student she had once looked down on had stood up and forced her to silence in front of everyone. Cartwright stared directly at Daniel, as if trying to find one last weakness to attack. But she found nothing, because Daniel wasn't the winner just because he was smart. He won because he didn't let others define his worth. And then Cartwright turned her back, heading toward the lectern. She didn't say another word. No justification, no real acknowledgement. Just a long silence, an undeniable defeat. Whitaker shook his head, stood up, but didn't say anything. He knew this wasn't the place for him to speak, because if he said anything now, it would only make their defeat even clearer. Daniel sat down. He didn't say anything, didn't look at anyone. He simply opened his notebook again, continuing to flip through the pages, as if what had just happened wasn't a confrontation, but just another problem he had solved. But the entire lecture hall knew that this wasn't just a problem. This was a change that Cartwright, Whitaker, and all those who had once looked down on him would have to remember forever. Cartwright sat silently at the lectern, but inside she was a storm of fury. She could tolerate a smart student, but she couldn't tolerate a student making her look foolish right in front of the faculty board. Daniel had not only proven her wrong, but he had also made other students start to question her authority. That was unacceptable. She couldn't let him walk out of this classroom as the victor. She needed a way to regain control, a way to push him into a game he could not win. She knew one thing for sure. Being smart is one thing. But when real pressure hits, how many can stand strong? And so she played her final card. Cartwright stood up, slowly walking to the center of the classroom, showing no signs of anger or disappointment. Instead, she smiled, a smile full of meaning, as if she had found an escape for herself. "Well done, Daniel." She spoke slowly, carefully, as though she was contemplating something deeper. "I must admit you're more capable than I thought." Some students gasped, as if they couldn't believe what they'd just heard. One whispered to a friend next to them, "Did she just compliment him?" But Daniel was not fooled. He knew this was not praise. It was another trap. And Cartwright didn't make them wait long to understand her intentions. "However," she continued, slowly walking back toward the lectern, "real talent doesn't just belong in a classroom." She placed her hand on a stack of textbooks and then looked directly at Daniel, her eyes gleaming as if she had just come up with the perfect way to put him in a position he could neither refuse nor win. "I think, with your level of ability, a problem on the board is no longer enough to challenge you." A silence filled the room. Whenever Cartwright spoke this way, it was never just an innocent suggestion. "Then why don't you try your hand at a real arena?" Some students looked up. A few even held their breath. "There's a national math competition next month, where the brightest minds from universities across the country will compete against each other." She paused a moment, letting her words sink in before continuing. "If you're as exceptional as you think, why not participate?" The room exploded. Whispers began to spread through the lecture hall. Students turned to each other, eyes wide in shock. One whispered in disbelief, "Wait, is she really challenging Daniel to enter the national math competition?" Another leaned forward, excited. "If he enters and wins, that would be the biggest shock in the history of the math department." But some were not so optimistic. This isn't just any competition. There are senior students, grad students, even geniuses from MIT and Stanford. No one can win there without years of experience. Cartwright knew exactly that. She hadn't chosen this competition randomly. She knew that the pressure of a national competition was unlike solving a problem in class. Under the time pressure, in front of hundreds of people, with competitors who had been training for years, anyone could break. And she believed that Daniel would be no different. All eyes turned to Daniel. Some waited for him to refuse. Others hoped he would accept. Some simply couldn't believe what was happening. But Cartwright didn't take her eyes off Daniel. She wanted to see him hesitate, wanted to see him confused, wanted to see him falter in the face of an overwhelming challenge. She knew he couldn't win, and if he lost, today's victory in class would be meaningless. She awaited his response, but instead of being confused or unsettled, Daniel simply nodded. No hesitation, no second thoughts, not even a moment's doubt. "All right, I'll participate." The atmosphere in the room exploded again. Some students stared wide-eyed, some were agape, others laughed in disbelief. One muttered softly, "What the hell? He just accepted that challenge as if it was a normal test?" Another said in shock, "There wasn't a single moment of hesitation. He's really serious." Cartwright raised an eyebrow. She had expected him to hesitate. She had expected him to think it over. She had expected him to refuse or at least be bewildered by the immense pressure. But he simply agreed, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Daniel slowly sat down, completely composed. He knew exactly what Cartwright was doing. He knew she thought this competition would be his limit, but she was wrong, because he didn't accept the challenge just to prove something to Cartwright. He accepted because he had always known that he belonged in this larger arena. Cartwright stood still, staring at him, showing no emotion. But inside, she felt a strange sensation. She had expected him to be afraid, but for the first time, she realized, could it be that I've just made the biggest mistake? The news about Daniel entering the national math competition spread through the school like wildfire. At first, it was just a buzz in the lecture halls, but before long it became the hot topic discussed in every corner of the halls, every cafe, and every row of seats in the library. Everyone knew about the first-year student who dared to step into the arena of geniuses, a place where even the best students had to tread carefully. Some students were excited about the challenge Daniel had accepted, seeing him as a hero who dared to challenge the invisible barriers that had existed in the academic world for so long. But there were also those who were skeptical, thinking he was overly confident in his abilities without understanding the harshness of the competition. Debates broke out everywhere, with some betting on him and others mocking him, certain that Daniel would not be able to withstand the pressure of competitors who had spent years preparing for the contest. Somewhere in those discussions, Whitaker maintained his rigid and skeptical stance. He didn't believe that a student like Daniel, without a solid academic foundation, without guidance from top professors, could step into the field of the greatest minds in the country. To him, people like Daniel were just fleeting flames that would soon burn out when faced with the harsh reality. But Daniel didn't care about the gossip. He wasn't seeking recognition from anyone and didn't need to prove anything to those who had never believed in him. He had only one goal: to prepare for the competition. And so, he threw himself into training like never before. 4 weeks, 28 days, hundreds of hours of study. Daniel turned the library into his second home. Every morning he arrived earlier than anyone else, opened his laptop, searched for the hardest problems from international math competitions, advanced textbooks, and exam papers that even the best struggled to solve. Equations, transformations, and high-level differential systems became the language he spoke every day. He didn't just solve problems mechanically. He tried to break down each one, analyzing every rule, and finding shortcuts that others didn't see. If a problem could be solved in 3 different ways, he would find all 3 solutions. If a formula could be proven by several different paths, he would walk down each one. To him, solving math wasn't just about finding an answer. It was about understanding every corner of the problem so that no obstacle could confuse him when facing the actual test. While he studied relentlessly, Brian, the only friend patient enough to follow his process, could only shake his head in disbelief. He couldn't understand what motivated Daniel to keep up such an intense study schedule for weeks on end without showing any signs of exhaustion. "Are you trying to turn yourself into a math machine?" Brian asked. Daniel didn't look up, his pen still moving quickly across the paper, eyes glued to the numbers in front of him. "I only have 1 month. I don't have time to rest." Brian sighed, but then became more serious when he realized his friend wasn't joking. "Listen, I know you're smart, but do you know who you're up against? The people in this competition aren't just good, they're geniuses. Some of them have been trained since childhood, learning from the best professors and using materials that ordinary people would never have access to. They don't just know math, they live and breathe it, and they don't make mistakes." Daniel paused for a moment, set down his pen, and looked Brian in the eye with a sharp gaze. "Good, because I don't make mistakes either." While Daniel continued his training, Cartwright wasn't idle. She didn't truly believe he could win, but she couldn't allow her name to be linked with a student who entered just to lose spectacularly. So, she sent him an advanced math packet, problems even harder than what he would face in the competition. Not to help him, but to see how much pressure he could withstand. She hoped he would give up before the actual contest. But Daniel didn't back down. He solved each problem, breaking through every limit he thought he had. He didn't just learn how to solve problems. He learned how to solve them in the most efficient, fastest, and most accurate ways. He practiced with a stopwatch, pushing himself to the absolute limit because he knew that in the competition, every second counted. He studied the thinking patterns of past champions, learned how they approached problems, and absorbed knowledge from the best to become even better. Throughout this time, Whitaker watched from a distance, but could find no sign of wavering in Daniel. He expected him to tire out, to get discouraged, to quit, but that didn't happen. Daniel only grew stronger. All efforts to stop him failed. The competition day was fast approaching. The entire department waited for the inevitable, a fall, a failure, a humiliation. But Daniel didn't wait for it. He just kept moving forward. Because he knew that while a month might not seem like much time, for someone ready to burn himself out completely, it was enough to change everything. And he was ready to change their world. The atmosphere in the large hall of the University of Pennsylvania grew tense as the candidates entered the exam room. This was no ordinary exam. It was the most prestigious national mathematics competition, gathering the brightest minds from top universities. The best students from MIT, Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, Caltech, all were here, each exuding the cold confidence of those who had triumphed in countless competitions before. Daniel walked in, feeling the gaze of hundreds of eyes upon him. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with skepticism, and some, especially those from prestigious schools, didn't even try to hide their contempt. At the judges' table, Cartwright sat alongside professors from the most renowned universities in the country. She showed no emotion, but her cold eyes swept over Daniel as if she was still waiting for the fall she was certain would come. In a corner of the room, Whitaker stood with his arms crossed, staring at him intently. If Daniel failed today, he wouldn't need to say anything. The truth would speak for itself. Daniel paid no attention to these stares. He didn't need anyone's belief in him. He had practiced, prepared, and overcome every challenge they tried to place before him. Today was not the day to hesitate. A voice echoed through the microphone, pulling everyone back to reality. Welcome, contestants, to the final round of the National Mathematics Exam. Those sitting in this room are the greatest mathematical minds of their generation, but today we will find out who is the best. All eyes turned to the large screen as the first question appeared. The most complex equations began to unfold. Triple integrals, Fourier series, complex function derivatives, advanced Laplace transforms, nonlinear differential equations. Each question was not for the faint of heart. Some contestants furrowed their brows from the very first question, their pens tightening in their grip. They realized this was not a simple problem they could solve immediately. But Daniel was unfazed. He didn't look around, didn't check the reactions of others. He only looked at the problem in front of him and began doing what he did best, solving it. He lifted his pen, his writing flowing effortlessly, without a moment's hesitation. The numbers appeared on the paper like an unbroken stream, transformations made precisely, without excess or omission. Some contestants paused to double-check their work, fearing they might have made a mistake. But Daniel didn't need to check. He had seen the solution the moment he finished reading the problem. Cartwright glanced at the clock and saw that Daniel was moving faster than most in the room. Her brow furrowed. At the judges' table, a professor from Stanford leaned over and whispered to the person next to them, "Who is that kid? How is he so fast?" "I don't know, but he's no ordinary opponent." The exam continued with increasing difficulty. Towards the end, the number of contestants still writing dwindled. Some had put their pens down, their faces showing confusion or disappointment. The final problems were designed to make even the best contestants stumble. Only two remained writing. Daniel and a PhD from MIT. He was unlike the other students. He wasn't flustered, wasn't tense. He was calm, composed, and most importantly, he wasn't making mistakes. He knew he was the strongest contender in the room. Cartwright smiled faintly. This was the moment she had been waiting for. If anyone could beat Daniel, it would be him. Whitaker began to look more relaxed, his cold gaze fixed on Daniel as if he already knew how this would end. He may be good, but he can't be better than an MIT PhD. The final question appeared. Everyone held their breath. This was no ordinary problem anymore. This was a challenge of thought, speed, and absolute precision. Both Daniel and his opponent glanced at the problem. The MIT PhD picked up his pen first, his eyes flashing with sharpness. Daniel only needed a second to understand everything he had to do. The real race had begun. Both wrote so quickly that even the judges had to pay attention. Lines of writing, symbols, and transformations appeared continuously on their papers, with no time to stop and think. This was no longer just mathematics. This was a battle. A professor from Princeton quietly whispered, "This is the speed of geniuses." The sound of pens scratching paper echoed in the quiet space. No one spoke. No one dared make any sudden moves. Time passed. The MIT PhD was nearing the answer. Cartwright looked at him, confidence filling her. This was the one who would beat Daniel. Then, suddenly, someone from the judge's table gasped. Daniel had stopped writing first. He was still writing. Daniel had finished. No strike-throughs, not a moment's hesitation. He closed his pen, set it down on the table, and sat back, arms crossed, waiting. Whitaker straightened up, Cartwright clenched her hands on the table, and the judges all turned their gaze toward Daniel. One judge stood and walked over to examine his work. Everyone held their breath. When he looked up, his eyes wide with astonishment, everyone understood. Daniel hadn't just solved the problem. He had solved it perfectly, concisely, and more elegantly than anyone else in the room. He had won. And at that moment, Cartwright knew she had made the biggest mistake of her life, thinking he could be defeated. The atmosphere in the auditorium seemed to freeze when the results of the previous problem were announced. Daniel not only solved it correctly, but also provided a solution more perfect than anyone else's. The judges, initially full of skepticism, could now only look at each other, exchanging disbelieving glances at what had just happened. Cartwright remained seated, but her hand unconsciously tightened around the edge of the table. She couldn't hide a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, unease. Whitaker couldn't hide his irritation. He leaned toward another judge, whispering something, but the response was just a shake of the head. No one could refute Daniel's result. But this was still not the end.